Grief is something we often associate with death or endings. But when it comes to life with a narcissist, the grief takes on a different, more complicated form. It is not just about mourning the end of a relationship. It is about mourning the reality you thought you had, the future you believed in, and the person you thought they were. This grief is not clean, and it doesn't follow a neat timeline. It lingers, sometimes quietly, sometimes like a storm that returns without warning. Even when you've walked away, even when years have passed, reminders can awaken it, a phrase they used to say, a place you once went together, or even watching someone else live the life you once hoped would be yours. Unlike conventional grief, this one is harder for others to understand. People around you may tell you to just move on or be grateful you're free. But the truth is, this grief is invisible. It is the loss of trust, of innocence, of believing in love without conditions. It is the loss of your own sense of safety in relationships. And here's the part that feels hardest to accept: this grief doesn't fully go away. There will always be moments when you feel its presence, but that doesn't mean you are broken. It means you are human. What you can do is allow the grief to reshape itself. Over time, it becomes less about loss and more about wisdom. It teaches you where your boundaries need to be. It sharpens your ability to recognize manipulation. It deepens your empathy, not for the narcissist, but for yourself and for others who have endured the same silent battles. The grief may never vanish, but it evolves. And as it evolves, so do you. It becomes a companion that reminds you not of what was taken, but of how much you've grown. Your task is not to erase the grief. Your task is to live alongside it, to let it soften you where it can and strengthen you where it must. Because healing from a narcissist is not about pretending you were never hurt. It's about rising with the knowledge that even with grief, you are still whole. The grief that lingers after an experience with a narcissist is unlike any other grief because it isn't simply about the person themselves. It is about the dream of who you thought they were and the future you imagined with them. When most people think of loss, they picture losing someone tangible, a partner leaving, a friendship ending, or even the death of someone dear. But when it comes to life with a narcissist, the loss is layered, and much of what you are grieving is something that never truly existed in the first place. In the early stages, narcissistic relationships often begin with intensity, excitement, and what feels like deep connection. You're made to believe you found something extraordinary, a soulmate, a partner who truly sees you, someone who promises a future filled with love, joy, and understanding. These promises and illusions weave themselves into your identity. You start to picture a life together, maybe a family, maybe shared goals, maybe even a version of yourself that feels finally complete because of them. And then, piece by piece, that illusion begins to unravel. What you are left to grieve is not just the end of a relationship. It's the loss of the narrative you were living in. You grieve the person they pretended to be, the affectionate, attentive, charming version of them that was never truly real. You grieve the life you thought you were building, the one that felt so possible during those moments of love, bombing, but was ultimately an illusion designed to keep you hooked. You even grieve the version of yourself that existed before you were pulled into the cycle, the part of you that trusted freely, that believed wholeheartedly, that loved without constantly questioning. This grief is complicated because it doesn't have clear edges. If someone dies, the finality is crushing but undeniable. With a narcissist, the grief can feel like trying to hold onto smoke. You are mourning something intangible, the fantasy of what could have been. That makes it harder to explain to others. When you tell people you're grieving, they might not understand. They may say, "But that person was awful to you. Why miss them?" Or, "Be glad it's over." On the surface, that seems logical, but the heart does not grieve only what was bad. It grieves what was hoped for, what was longed for, what was promised and never delivered. The grief is also tied to disorientation. You begin to question, were those good moments real? Did I ever actually know them? Did I waste years of my life? The ambiguity leaves you spinning. Unlike traditional loss, there is no single event to close the chapter. Instead, the grief is about reconciling two conflicting realities, the person you believed in versus the person they truly were. This grief is particularly cruel because it requires you to let go of something you never actually had. And yet, it can feel just as real, if not more painful, than grieving something tangible. The bond you believed in was real to you, and the hope it gave you was real to you. Losing that hope can feel like losing a part of yourself. What makes this grief endure is how deeply it touches your sense of identity. You're not just mourning them, you're mourning who you were when you believed in them. You're mourning your openness, your innocence, your unguarded trust. It's a kind of grief that makes you reevaluate your past, your choices, and your ability to trust in the future. But understanding this grief is essential. Recognizing that you are grieving not only the relationship, but also the illusion allows you to stop blaming yourself for why you can't just get over it. You're not being weak. You're navigating a unique kind of loss that is both real and surreal at the same time. And by naming it for what it is, the grief of the dream, you give yourself permission to process it with compassion rather than shame. The grief that follows a narcissist is grief for the life you thought you were living and the love you thought you had found. It's grief for the story you told yourself about what your future could be. And while this grief doesn't follow a straight line and never completely disappears, acknowledging its roots helps you to carry it differently. Over time, it shifts from being a weight that crushes you to a reminder of the resilience you've had to develop. It becomes proof of how deeply you can hope, how deeply you can love, and ultimately, how much you deserve to rebuild, not with illusions, but with truth. The grief that comes after a narcissistic relationship often hides in plain sight, because it does not carry the visible signs people expect. When someone has endured loss, when we lose a loved one to death or separation, the world recognizes that grief. There are rituals, words of comfort, and sympathy. People bring food, send flowers, or simply sit with you in your pain. But when the loss is tied to a narcissistic relationship, the wounds are invisible, and the grief is harder for others to comprehend. This invisibility makes the healing process lonelier and far more complex. Unlike physical injuries or traditional forms of loss, the emotional wounds caused by a narcissist do not announce themselves to the outside world. You may show up at work, Handle your responsibilities, smile for others, and appear fine. Yet beneath the surface, there is an ongoing ache that no one else seems to notice. It is the silent replay of their cruel words, the echo of their indifference, or the hollow emptiness left by years of being dismissed, gaslit, or diminished. To the outside eye, nothing seems wrong. Inside, it feels as though you are carrying a wound that never fully closes. This kind of grief is also made more invisible because it challenges the narratives people hold about relationships. Friends or family might say, "But you left. Shouldn't you be happy now?" Or, "At least it wasn't worse." These statements may be well-intentioned, but they minimize the experience, leaving survivors feeling unseen. The truth is, you may be free of the person, but the psychological scars remain. You are grieving not only what you endured, but also the part of yourself that felt erased during the relationship. The invisibility of this pain means you often carry it quietly, unsure if others will understand, hesitant to share for fear of judgment. Another reason this grief is hidden is because narcissistic abuse itself is subtle. It rarely leaves obvious marks. Instead, it is the erosion of your confidence, the constant self-doubt planted by gaslighting, the way you second-guess your own memory or feelings. This subtlety makes it harder to explain. How do you tell someone that you are grieving the way you were slowly taught to distrust yourself? How do you articulate the weight of being unseen in a relationship that was supposed to offer love and connection? Without visible evidence, the grief is often dismissed, which only deepens the isolation. This invisibility also creates an added layer of shame. Survivors may ask themselves, "Why am I still struggling? Why can't I move on faster?" The lack of acknowledgement from the outside world can reinforce this self-blame. Yet the truth is, the very invisibility of these wounds is what makes them harder to process. When grief is recognized, it can be shared and supported. When grief is invisible, it is shouldered in silence. That silence keeps people stuck, believing something is wrong with them, when in fact, something very real has happened to them. The invisible wounds often show up in subtle, everyday ways. You may find yourself tensing when someone raises their voice, even if they mean no harm. You may doubt your worth when starting a new relationship, replaying the criticism you endured as though it were truth. You may shrink back from opportunities because a voice in your head, one that was never yours to begin with, tells you that you will fail. These wounds are not visible, but they shape the way you move through the world. They color how safe you feel, how much trust you extend, and how much space you allow yourself to take up. Understanding that this grief is invisible is the first step toward validating it for yourself. You may not have a scar to point to, but your pain is real. You may not have a crowd to mourn with you, but your loss is worthy of acknowledgement. Healing begins when you stop comparing your grief to the visible grief of others and recognize that your invisible wounds are no less deserving of compassion. Over time, the invisibility of this grief can become less of a burden and more of a source of strength. You learn to name it for yourself, even if others cannot see it. You learn to recognize that the absence of external validation does not make your pain imaginary. And slowly, the invisible wound shifts. It may not disappear, but it transforms into resilience, into wisdom, into a kind of quiet courage. That courage is what allows you to move forward, to carry your grief without letting it define you, and to trust that your invisible wounds are not a sign of weakness, but a testament to your survival. One of the most disorienting parts of grieving after a narcissistic relationship is that it never moves in a straight line. Just when you believe you've gained your footing, just when you start to feel like the heaviness is behind you, something small can jolt you right back into the ache. These are the cycles of reminders, the triggers that reopen the wound and make the grief feel unfinished. They arrive uninvited and unpredictable, often when you least expect them, and they remind you that healing is not about erasing the past, but about learning to live with its echoes. A song on the radio, a phrase spoken by someone else, or even the way a stranger laughs can transport you back instantly to moments you thought you had buried. These reminders are not always about the bad times either. Sometimes they are tied to the fleeting moments of tenderness or connection you once thought were genuine. That is what makes them so powerful. They hold both the pain of betrayal and the sweetness of what you believe to be love. The heart struggles to separate the two, and so the grief resurfaces. Places often carry these reminders too. Walking past a cafe you once visited together, driving by a street you used to take, or even scrolling through social media can awaken memories with startling force. You may find yourself grieving not just the relationship, but also the version of yourself who walked those paths with hope. The cycles of reminders are cruel because they are not bound by time. Whether it has been months or years, the smallest trigger can pull you back into a place that feels raw and immediate. Even certain behaviors in other people can trigger the grief. Perhaps a colleague uses a dismissive tone similar to what you endured, or a friend repeats a phrase the narcissist often used. Suddenly, you are not just reacting to the present moment, but to an entire history of wounds. Your body remembers, even when your mind tries to move on. This is why survivors sometimes feel like they are overreacting, when in truth, they are simply carrying unhealed echoes of the past. These cycles make the grief feel like it has no end. Instead of moving forward in a linear progression, you find yourself circling back again and again. That can feel exhausting and demoralizing. You may ask yourself, why am I still here? Why can't I just be done with this? But the truth is, these reminders are part of the process. They don't mean you've failed at healing. They mean you are human, and that the imprint of the experience was profound. What makes these reminders especially painful is that they highlight the duality of what you lost. You grieve the cruelty and the manipulation, but you also grieve the moments of hope, of possibility, of what you thought could have been. A trigger can call back both sides at once, and that combination can feel overwhelming. This is why the grief feels unfinished. It never neatly categorizes itself into good or bad. It is tangled, and those tangles resurface when reminders arise. But there is also a hidden opportunity within these cycles. Each reminder is not only a return to pain, but also a chance to process it differently than you did before. The first time a song makes you cry, you may feel devastated. Months later, the same song may still hurt, but you notice you recover more quickly. Over time, reminders shift from being wounds that reopen to scars that simply ache. They will always be there, but they lose their power to consume you. Learning to expect these cycles helps. When you accept that reminders will come, you stop blaming yourself for their presence. You stop seeing them as signs of weakness and start viewing them as natural waves of memory and feeling. Just as the ocean never stops producing waves, your mind and heart will continue producing reminders. The goal is not to stop the waves, but to learn how to ride them without being pulled under. Ultimately, these cycles of reminders are proof that the relationship mattered, even if it was painful. They show that you invested, that you believed, that you cared deeply. And while the reminders may never disappear completely, they can evolve. They can transform from sharp pangs of grief into quiet acknowledgments of where you have been and how far you have come. Each time a reminder arises, you are given another chance to reaffirm your strength, to recognize your growth, and to choose how you respond now. That is how the cycles, over time, become less about being trapped in the past and more about stepping more firmly into your present. Grief after a narcissistic relationship is not something that ever truly disappears, but it does have the power to transform. At first, it feels suffocating, like a heavy cloak draped over you that you never asked to wear. It can feel unfair, exhausting, and endless. Yet as time moves forward, something shifts. The grief does not leave, but it changes shape. It begins to carve out new space within you, a space that holds wisdom, resilience, and self-awareness you might never have developed without having endured what you did. This is the paradox. The very grief that once felt unbearable can become the soil in which your growth is rooted. In the beginning, it is difficult to see anything beyond the loss. The memories, the betrayals, the confusion, they dominate your inner world. But slowly, as you sit with the grief, rather than trying to push it away, you start to notice lessons buried inside it. You realize that the relationship taught you about the importance of boundaries, about listening to the small alarms in your gut that you once ignored, about recognizing the difference between words and actions. These lessons are hard-won, but they are invaluable. They become tools you carry into every future interaction, protecting you from falling into similar patterns again. This growth within the grief is not sudden. It is gradual, unfolding almost invisibly. One day you catch yourself recognizing manipulation quickly, where before you might have rationalized it. Another day you hear a critical comment, and instead of absorbing it as truth, you pause and ask yourself if it really belongs to you. These are subtle shifts, but together they form a foundation of strength. The grief that once kept you stuck becomes the teacher that propels you forward. There is also a deepening of self-awareness that emerges. Being with a narcissist often forces you to examine parts of yourself you had not considered before. Your patterns of giving too much, your tolerance for mistreatment, your desire to believe in people, even when they show you otherwise. At first, looking at these parts of yourself may feel painful, but eventually it leads to empowerment. You start to see that your willingness to love deeply is not a weakness, but a strength. You learn that you can still be compassionate without abandoning yourself. This self-awareness reshapes your identity into one that is more grounded and authentic. Grief also nurtures empathy, not for the narcissist, but for yourself and for others who have endured similar experiences. you begin to understand just how isolating it feels when pain is dismissed or minimized. That understanding makes you gentler with yourself and more compassionate toward others who carry invisible wounds. What once made you feel broken begins to connect you to a broader human experience, reminding you that healing is not about perfection, but about honesty and compassion. Another part of this growth lies in the way grief reframes your relationship with hope. At first, hope may feel shattered. You may wonder if you can ever trust again, if you can ever love without fear. But over time, grief teaches you that hope is not about blindly believing in others. It is about believing in your own ability to rebuild. You come to see that while grief never vanishes, it no longer has to control you. Instead, it can sit quietly beside you, a reminder of where you've been while you continue to move forward with clarity and strength. This transformation does not mean the grief becomes pleasant. It still hurts. There will still be days when memories sting and moments when reminders pull you back. But the difference is that the grief no longer defines you. It informs you. It teaches you how to protect your peace, how to value your own worth, and how to trust yourself again. In the end, the growth within grief is not about erasing the past or pretending it didn't happen. It is about carrying it differently. It is about allowing the pain to shape you into someone wiser, someone stronger, and someone more attuned to themselves. The grief may always be present, but it transforms from a constant weight into a quiet companion. A companion that whispers not about what was lost, but about how much you have gained in the process of surviving and healing.